amounts of copying, and also that our grading had little relationship to paper quality. And we saw that because in the expert's report, which is appended to the appendix here, points out, for example, 2 papers, one which was mostly copied material, by all measures, a pretty insubstantial and not well done paper, and another one which was really nicely done, a great piece of work, completely original, and they both got the exact same grade. So that was an important analysis to determine the sufficiency of the student work despite the deficiencies of these classes. Now we move on to the category that was of particular importance to the Chancellor and the President when they gave us our mandate. And that was they wanted us to find out what these paper classes were, why they happened, how they operated, but they also wanted to know who knew about them, who on campus knew about them, and who took any actions that showed that they were complicit with these classes. And keep in mind, and I think it's important for everybody to focus on this, there's knowledge and there's knowledge. There are a lot of people on campus who knew that these were easy classes. A lot of people who knew that they were, and then some number who knew that they were designated as lecture classes but taught as independent studies. But it was a smaller, much smaller group who knew that there really wasn't even a professor involved and that Deborah Crowder was doing the grading. That's the knowledge that we were focused on, to try to find out who knew about that and who took no steps in response. Let me just go through these categories and tell you what we found, and this is all laid out in the report. The first category is the steel building academic advisors, and those are the academic advisors who work with the students across campus, not just the athletes, but across campus. And there were some number of them who would direct students over to Deborah Crowder for placement in these paper classes. They, however, said we knew they were easy classes, we knew they were good for some of these students who had troubles, but we had no idea that there was no professor involved and no idea that Debbie was doing the grading. And we believe that, and we found confirmation for that. So we do not have any evidence that they knew about the real deficiencies of these classes. Next group to address is the ASPSA academic counselors. And once again, these are the folks who provide academic tutoring and counseling to the student athletes. And that's where we did find knowledge and complicity. We found that 5 of the ASPSA counselors knew exactly what was going on with these classes. And Debbie Crowder took steps to try to mask what she was doing. We found lots of emails where she talks about trying not to raise red flags. And that's one reason why the knowledge of these classes was limited. But 5 of these counselors knew exactly what was going on. And they took affirmative steps to take advantage of them. They steered a number of their student athletes to these classes specifically because they were easy, specifically because they were, in their terms, GPA boosters. They knew that these were classes that gave disproportionately high grades regardless of quality, and that was good for the student athletes' GPAs. We had 2 of them who, as I said, suggested grades to Deborah Crowder. And then this last category is one I want to spend a few minutes on, and this was, I think, particularly illuminating. There were several football counselors who took a series of actions in 2008. They took those actions once Debbie Crowder announced that she'd be retiring. And this is what they did to try to mitigate the impact of Debbie Crowder no longer being around to offer those paper classes. First thing they did is they encouraged their student athletes to take the last year of paper classes. They said, look, you only have 1 more year of these classes, you better take them. We heard about that from people, and then we saw it. This is a graph that shows the number of student athletes who took, or number of student athlete enrollments who took the paper classes starting 1999 through 2009. Blue line is men's football, red line is men's basketball, green is women's basketball, and purple is everything else, what we call Olympic. And you see there was a downward slope there in 2005 through 2008. That was because there were questions being raised about the number of independent studies coming out of the AFAM department. But then you see for men's football and the Olympic sports, it goes right back up in 2008, 2009. And the reason it does that is because they realize that Debbie's leaving. They think that's the end of the paper classes. They want to get as many of those classes under their student athletes' belts as possible. Notice, though, that the women's basketball numbers stay down, and the men's basketball numbers continue to decline in that same period that the football numbers are going straight up. So that was the first thing they did in response to the news about Deborah Crowder's retirement. The second thing they did is they encouraged their student athletes, their players, to get their papers in on time, specifically so that Deborah Crowder could liberally grade their papers and not a professor. So what you have here is, this is a flyer that was handed out by a counselor to football players saying, as you can see in that box, Debbie Crowder is retiring the following week, so if you would prefer that she read and grade your paper rather than Professor Nangora, you'll need to have the paper completed before the last day of classes, making it very clear that those summer school students needed to get their papers in if they wanted her to grade the papers more advantageously. Similarly, an email from another one of the counselors saying, Ms. Crowder is retiring at the end of July. If the guys' papers are not in, I would expect D's and C's at best. Most need better than that. All work from the AFM department must be done and turned in on the last day of class. The most need better than that is a clear reference to her keeping an eye on the impact that these inflated grades have on student-athlete eligibility. The third thing that they did in response to Deborah Crowder's departure was they gave a clear warning to the football coaching staff. And when I say they, this is the several football counselors who were steering students over to the AFM department. And the slide that you see right here is a slide that was presented by two of the counselors in one of the regular meetings that they held with the football coaching staff. And the premise of this is they're trying to tell make it clear to the coaching staff that the end of these paper classes is a real problem, and kids are going to have to measure up on their own. They're not going to get no longer going to have the crutch of the paper classes. And what they talk about here is what was part of the solution in the past. That's the solution to getting unmotivated student athletes to perform. And this, by the way, only relates to a small subset of those student athletes. And that you'll see that that's the context here. But they said, what is the part of the solution? We put them in classes that met degree requirements in which they didn't go to class, they didn't take notes, have to stay awake, they didn't have to meet with professors, they didn't have to pay attention or necessarily engage with the material. And those classes were the AFAM, AFRI seminar classes with 20 to 25 page papers, and in bold, these no longer exist. So ringing the alarm bell for the coaching staff that they're going to have to provide more support to these kids and also think on the front end about their recruitment standards to make sure that these kids could cut it academically without the crutch of these paper classes. And to reinforce the point, there's a second slide, actually a series of slides, in which they give specific examples, and in fact the student name is whited out there, but struggles academically and lacks responsibility is the category of student athletes who fit that profile. You see the first one has a student athlete with a 2.2 grade point average, and they indicate that the AFAM GPA, the GPA they learned in those classes was 3.7, their other GPA generally 1.86. So they draw that comparison just to hammer home the point that these classes were critical to these students staying afloat. And then the fourth thing that they did in response to Deborah Crowder retiring is they went to Professor Nangora and tried to persuade him to offer these classes.